Hi, this is Dean Gerdeman from AIR, and once again, I'll be your guide through this video module. This module is the third in a series to support STEP teams' understanding and application of the measurement principles, tools, and practices of the STEP project. In this module, we focus on applying the three-step measurement criteria of rigor, relevance, and sensitivity to your efforts in gathering and interpreting data in the discovery phase. These criteria have been developed in collaboration between teachers, coaches, and researchers to help STEP teams use data soundly and improve confidence in deriving meaning from the measures you use. Keeping these principles at the forefront of your work will increase your likelihood of success in discovering exceptional practices in STEP. Now that you have identified a challenge and aim for your work in STEP, and have at least begun to measure your baselines in terms of student learning, teaching practices, and conditions for professional collaboration, you are ready to begin the Discover phase. As you know, the primary goal of this phase is to discover uncommon teaching practices that you or your colleagues already may be using to support student growth that is meaningful and measurably better than what typically occurs in your school. To achieve this goal, your team will use sound data and measurement techniques to answer the following three questions in this phase. 1. In which classrooms are particular students or student subgroups performing better or growing more than is typically observed on tasks related to your team's challenge? 2. What promising instructional practices are the teachers of these students using that may be associated with the positive outcomes? And 3. Which of these practices are most likely to be exceptional and therefore worth testing in the Confirm phase? Exceptional practices are the teaching practices that are uniquely effective in building or accelerating student outcomes related to your challenge. To answer the first question regarding where students are performing better, your team will start by looking for patterns in the quantitative student outcome measures you've been gathering. When deciding upon measures to examine in the Discover phase, it is important to consider, as a team, the extent to which student measures meet the STEP criteria of rigor, relevance, and sensitivity. General advice here is to use feasible measures in which the team has confidence and for which it recognizes the key limitations, rather than trying to find or create the strongest possible or ideal measures. Together, you will use the data to consider questions such as the following. How does student performance vary across classrooms? Are there groups of students performing meaningfully better than typical levels of performance? Are there particular teachers, grade levels, subjects, or programs with more successful students? What are potential explanations for patterns observed in the data? And what else should be measured to learn more? The purpose of asking these questions is to find classrooms in which the measures suggest that unusually effective practices are occurring. Directing your team's exploration on those classrooms and teachers will help focus the search for exceptional teaching practices. Here are some tips that should help you answer these questions. First, use quantitative student outcomes data linked to classrooms as much as possible. Second, examine not only mean scores for each classroom or subgroup, but also the distribution and spread of scores. The latter can provide important clues for where exceptional practice may be occurring. Third, explore the data across classrooms, across subgroups, and over time. Fourth, use graphical and visual presentations of the data as much as possible. It is useful to have a common template for these if you're looking for patterns across different data sets or subsets. Finally, look for unusual, interesting patterns such as where there might be examples of positive deviance in the data. Even after all this, you may not find definitive answers to your team's questions. However, a careful examination of the data should yield a number of classrooms that are worth exploring further. This work may require stretching your current comfort level or knowledge base with statistics and data analysis. Built into the STEP process is an expectation that STEP teams will have support from district colleagues who have experience in data analysis and presentation. This support may include consulting, providing local data tools and software, conducting analysis, and sharing findings. STEP teams should seek the support they need in this aspect of the work. Your coach will now pause the video so that you can look together at some simple data to help make sense of these abstract ideas. You likely learned that even with these simplified data measuring student skills, no one classroom stood out, and the data may raise more questions than provide answers. Nevertheless, the data in this example do point to some classrooms in which the STEP team is more likely to discover promising practices. Your coach probably emphasized this, but it bears repeating. The point of this deep dive into data is not to search for a star teacher or classroom, but to find several classrooms in which students seem to have acquired particular skills or competencies at higher rates or more quickly than in other classrooms. Once you have used data to identify several classrooms in which students are demonstrating better outcomes, it is time to systematically learn more about what teachers in those classrooms are doing and how they were doing it. In other words, you are ready to investigate the second main question for the Discover phase. What promising instructional practices are teachers of these students using that may be associated with the positive outcomes? Before I dive in with suggestions for how to collect and analyze the data to answer that question, let's hear from Italia Lee, who we met in the first two video modules, describing how her team approached the Discover phase.
In the Discover phase, the way that they gathered their evidence was both through their informal, formal visits, those observations, the anecdotal notes that were made, as well as the information from their weekly quizzes and district unit assessments. So taking all of that together and along with their professional judgment, because really the data is there to enhance their professional judgment, not replace it, because there's just many factors. And so they really were discovering too, the variables too in their discussions about data, in particular like to populations, like some had intensive structured English classes, others had GATE class, so those were all taken into account as well when they went to discuss the evidence.
And how did you as a facilitator help them along in this process of making meaning from these data in Discover?
As a facilitator, helping them through this process of data analysis, it's really about them, again, going back to that building data literacy, opening it up to them to take ownership, to create, to edit, to make it their own, because when they see the purpose for something, they understand that and it makes sense, because then they share it out with the rest of the staff, not on the STEP team. For example, we had 80% of the staff give to their students the student perception and survey, which was the math attitude and interest survey. We got 80% response with that. We also got 100% response from the teacher survey of mathematical practice and community conditions. And so they are able to own it, understand it, and then share that with others. And when they're able to share that with others, that shows their own understanding. And back to the discussions though, it really was just them asking them to think critically of what do you see, what strengths, what areas of growth, are there any intriguing findings as well. So it's them coming together and reaching those conclusions.
Natalia's description of how the Discover phase played out in her school, note the importance of collaboratively discussing the data and the need for being clear about your team's measurement goals. There are at least 3 data collection methods that most STEP teams will use to explore teaching practices in this part of the Discover phase: one-on-one interviews, group interviews, and collegial classroom visits. One-on-one interviews consist of one STEP team member asking an identified teacher carefully crafted and specific questions about his or her practices. One-on-one interviews provide in-depth data on instructional practice reflections from a particular teacher conducted outside the classroom. The interview protocol should be designed in advance with input from the STEP team, and all interviewers should follow a similar protocol, tailored if needed to the individual teachers and contexts of interest. Group interviews, or focus groups, consist of interviewers asking questions to several teachers at a time to get at the group's ideas and experiences. This method allows participants to reflect on and build off one another's answers. The questions need to be carefully constructed ahead of time, including potential prompts and probes to use if needed to catalyze conversation. Before I talk about the third option for collecting data in the Discover phase, let's pause and discuss the pros and cons of each form of interview technique and look at some example interview questions. The third type of measure likely to be used in the Discover phase to explore teaching practices, collegial classroom visits, is a useful method for discovering promising teaching practices. Teachers in Long Beach who first engaged in STEP chose the term collegial visit to capture the spirit of learning and inquiry about practices. In a collegial visit, one or more STEP team members observe a colleague's classroom during lessons or activities related to the challenge area. Using a common observation tool, the visiting team members record what they observe, data, about teacher practice and behaviors, as well as student work, activities and behavior, and other relevant information about the context of the classroom. Collegial visits can include pre- or post-observation interview components to understand more fully the teaching practices being implemented in the classroom. Your team will likely create your own observation tool or protocol that is specific to the kinds of information your team is interested in gathering. There are more close-ended tools where visiting team members count how many times they observe a specific behavior, as well as more open-ended protocols where visiting teachers record nearly everything that happens in the course of a lesson within targeted categories. Each approach has pros and cons. You can refer to the playbook for more guidance on this. Welcome back. You've had a chance to learn about 3 useful approaches for gathering data on teaching practices: one-on-one interviews, group interviews, and collegial visits. Keep in mind that there are other approaches your team may consider for gathering data on practices, such as student perception surveys, teacher surveys, and teaching logs such as Plan, Do, Study, Act models. For all approaches, it is important for STEP team members to be upfront with participants about the goals of collecting the data, how the data will be used, and how the confidentiality of their responses will be respected. Next, I want to highlight how to design and use the data collection instruments or protocols in ways that can help meet the STEP measurement criteria of rigor, relevance, and sensitivity. First, test or pilot the protocol or instrument you plan to use before jumping in. Try using it with a teacher who is not part of the team to make sure the questions are clear and make sense, that they are not too long or redundant, and that they yield the kind of relevant information the team is seeking. Second, ensure that all team members who use a protocol use it consistently. A good way to promote consistency is to engage in a calibration process in which the team members agree in advance on what each component of a protocol means and how and when to use it. Then, after using the protocol 1 or 2 times, team members would compare and contrast the evidence they collected to ensure that they were all interpreting and implementing the protocol consistently. And third, refer to the tools and resources available through STEP as you develop plans for data collection and for systematically recording and documenting evidence of your discoveries. Once you have collected data on teacher practices using sound methods, you will need to work together to make sense of all the various data components you have collected. It requires time and effort to analyze these kinds of data that come in the form of narratives, anecdotes, and observation notes, and to sort into categories and display findings in a way that makes the search for patterns across the categories more feasible. More guidance on this type of analysis will be available in your coach's playbook. One good place to start is to list all the teaching practices that came up in the interviews or were observed during collegial visits. For each practice, summarize information about the context in which the practices occurred and identify any evidence collected on students' immediate responses or subsequent outcomes that may be related to those practices. To help analyze the data, you could make tables using spreadsheet software, develop concept maps showing relationships in the data, or use old-fashioned poster paper and markers to group and present findings. You will want to select approaches that enable the team to visualize findings linking teaching practices to student measures and compare and discuss interpretations. Regardless of the data collection and analysis approach your team has taken, it is important to document what you are learning from your collaborative discussions about the evidence for your discoveries. Remember, the key is not just to find practices that are particularly interesting or intriguing, but practices that have at least some evidence that they might be exceptional practices that can move students toward overcoming the challenge your team has described in the challenge name statement. After collecting and summarizing data on the instructional practices you believe are linked to better student outcomes, it is time to decide together on an answer to the third question for the Discover phase. Which of these practices are most likely to be exceptional and worth testing in the Confirm phase? There is no single standard for determining whether a practice should be further tested in the Confirm phase. Your coach will encourage you to assess the evidence and employ facilitation strategies for your team to come to a consensus on which practices are promising enough to take instructional time to test in the next step phase. Here's Atalia Lee talking about how her STEP team used evidence to decide which practices to bring into the Confirm phase.
The types of evidence that helped move the team from Discover to Confirm were really when the observations of what they were seeing in the classrooms was really matching what they were seeing in the data that they had collected through their weekly quizzes. And when they saw those pieces together, there were some, such as peer tutoring, that really stood out, and they were also noticing at cross-grade level that was happening. Like there were similar strategies that were being used and that were yielding better results. And so when those things were aligned, it was obvious, oh, well, maybe that's something that we should all try out.
In Atalia's case, the promising practices emerged clearly from the data they had been collecting. In your team's case, it may take several interviews, group interviews, and collegial visits and revisiting the data several times to uncover some promising practices that you feel confident enough in the evidence to bring into the Confirm phase. We recommend bringing more than one practice to the Confirm phase to allow your team to compare results across different practices. Also, remember, not all practices thought to be promising in the Discover phase are confirmed in the next phase. It is expected that some of the practices explored in the Confirm phase will in fact not lead to further evidence of improved student performance. In other cases, practices may be modified and tested again. STEP is an iterative process of investigation and reflection, and many teams may find themselves revisiting the Discover phase on the way to ultimately identifying practices that effectively address their challenge area. Once the team has selected the practices, it is critical to clearly articulate and describe those practices so that any team member or other colleagues who test the practices in their classrooms fully understand the practices and can implement them as intended. Tools such as practice flow maps are useful for this purpose. In the next video module, we will delve into the role of data and measurement in the Confirm phase. In the meantime, we wish you the best of luck and useful data as you work to discover exceptionally effective practice among your colleagues.